Today we will discuss the species category, in which we will study biological species concept and evolutionary species concept. Previously we had discussed typological species concept and nominalistic species concept, and it was realized in the 18th century that these first two species concept were not applicable to the living organisms, so they were not applicable to the biological species. Jordan in 1905 discussed for the first time a new species concept, and along with all its consequences of the philosophy, which means that it was critically analyzed. He presented the new species concept, in which he combined the elements of the typological species concept and nominalistic species concept by stating that it has independent reality and are typified by the statistics of population of individuals, which means that species has been given a reality by explaining the morphological characters of that particular species, considering the members of a population rather than considering one animal. Different members of the population were considered and a range of characters was analyzed, and this way the species was typified. Number 2, it differs from both by stressing the populational nature and genetic cohesion of the species, which explains that again for the explanation of the species, populations were considered, and genetically the reproductive cohesion was also considered for understanding the status of the species. Number 3, the species receives its reality from the historically evolved shared information in its gene pool. Gene pool means the number of alleles present in a population of a species. So it was considered as a genetic unit as well. Biological species concept. The members of a species form a reproductive unit, in which we say that the genetic cohesion is considered while defining a species. The individuals of a species of animals recognize each other as potential mates and seek each other for the purpose of reproduction, and multitude of devices ensure intraspecific reproduction in all organisms. It means that there are a number of mechanisms which confirm the isolation of two different species. When difficulties are encountered, it is important to focus on the basic biological meaning of a species. A species is a protected gene pool. It is a Mendelian population shielded by its own devices, which means every species is protected by its own isolating mechanism against unsettling gene from other gene pool, so that genes of one species cannot be intermingled with the genes of other species. It is a classification of isolating mechanisms. These are the isolating mechanisms which prevent the intermingling of genes of one species into the gene pool of other species. There are basic two types of the isolation. One is pre-mating isolation, and other is post-mating but pre-zygotic isolation, and there is another one which is post-zygotic isolation. In pre-mating isolation, interspecific pairs do not form. The mechanism may be ecological, allochronic, ethological, or mechanical. In ecological mechanism, pairs do not form because of differences in preferred habitat. So that is the reason why ecological parameters are important to study when we are working on the species identification. Similarly, plants grow in different habitats, do not exchange pollen. So that leads to a reproductive isolation. Then there is allochronic. Males of one species and females of other species are sexually active at different times of a day or a year, which leads to reproductive isolation. There are examples in the frog species where certain species were active in April and other species were active in October, due to what? There was a reproductive isolation. Pollen production in one species does not overlap in time with the receptivity of stigmas in the other. Number 3, ethological. Mating signals and responses are incompatible. A male or a female does not respond to the mating signals, due to what? They become incompatible with each other. That is an ethological reason of isolation. Flowers do not attract the same pollinators. Number 4, mechanical. Successful copulation is prevented by physical incompatibility of the genitalia. And number 4, in the plants, successful pollination is prevented by the features of the floral morphology. This is what we say pre-mating isolation, which do not allow interspecific pair formation. Post-mating but pre-zygotic isolation, in which interspecific pairs form but fertilization does not occur. The mechanism is gamete viability. In animals, sperms do not survive in the female reproductive tract, and in the plants, pollen do not germinate or pollen tube growth is inhibited. Gamete recognition. Sperms do not recognize eggs or are incompatible with them, which may be due to the surface proteins of the eggs, which do not bind with those of the sperms. Pollen nuclei do not recognize or fuse with the egg nuclei. Then there is post-zygotic isolation, in which hybrid inviability. Interspecific zygotes have a reduced probability of survival to maturity. Hybrid sterility. Interspecific zygotes have reduced fertility. Hybrid breakdown. Hybrids produce sterile or inviable offsprings. These are a number of isolating mechanisms which do not allow the flow of genes from one gene pool into another gene pool, and this is how we say that there are multitude of devices which protect the gene flow of one species into that of. Then we say it is an ecological unit which, regardless of the individuals that constitute it, interacts as a unit with other species with which it shares its environment. We can take an example of the finches which were found by Darwin in Galapagos Island. There were 14 different species, and they had their own ecological unit because they were reproductively isolated because of the food they used to obtain. So they were feeding on different parts of the plant, and the availability of the flower was, the time of the availability of the flower was different from that of the availability of a fruit. So that was the reason why every group of finches had become a separate ecological unit, which later led to the reproductive isolation, even because that led to an allochronic isolation. They started becoming reproductively active at different times of the year in different the year. So ecology is a very important aspect when you are studying the reproductive isolation. Number 3 is genetic unit. Species consisting of a large intercommunicating gene pool, whereas individual organism is merely a temporary vessel holding a small portion of contents of the gene pool for a very short period of time. So, a species is a group of interbreeding natural populations that is reproductively isolated from other such groups with their own gene pool. This species concept is called biological not because it deals with the biological taxa, but because the definition is biological. It utilizes criteria that are meaningless in the inanimate world. We are using the word species and we are defining it on the basis of reproductive isolation, we are defining it on the basis of ecological parameters, we are considering it as genetic unit. So, if we apply these three terms to any inanimate object, it would not be meaningful, it would give no results. So, because of the biological parameters, we say that the definition is biological. Genes from the same gene pool form harmonious combinations because they have become co-adapted by natural selection. If we mix genes of two different species, there would be disharmonious gene combinations. Mechanisms that prevent this are therefore favored by selection. This makes it clear that the word species in biology is a relative term. That is, A is a species in relation to B and C because it is reproductively isolated from them. This concept has its primary significance with respect to sympatric and synchronic populations, non-dimensional species, and these are precisely the situations where application of the concept poses the fewest difficulties. Biological species concept is a non-dimensional species concept because in this we do not consider time and space. The more distant two populations are in space and time, the more difficult it becomes to test their species status in relation to each other, but the more biologically irrelevant this status becomes. The biological species combines the discreteness of the local species at a given time with an evolutionary potential for continuing change. Importance of biological species concept. The biological species concept also solves conflict between the fixicity of the species of the naturalist and the fluidity of the species of an evolutionist. Generally, the naturalists who considered fixicity of the species were of the concept that there was no evolution in the species, while the naturalists who were considering the fluidity of the species were of the evolutionist concept. It was this conflict that made Linnaeus deny evolution and Darwin deny the reality of the species. It is employed in the largest number of biological disciplines, particularly ecology, physiology, and behavioral biology. In these disciplines, one deals with the action of species in one locality at one time. One deals with the coexisting gene pools and with the mechanisms that maintain their integrity and explain their capacity for coexistence. For all those who work with a species in a non-dimensional situation where they do not consider the time and space, it is usually material whether another population, well isolated in space or time, should be considered conspecific. The word conspecific means belonging to the same species. So, the conclusion is taxa of the species category can be delimited against each other by operationally defined criteria. For example, interbreeding versus non-interbreeding of the population. So, it means that reproductive isolation is the criteria to delimit a species. Number 2, it is the only taxonomic category for which the boundaries of the included taxa can be defined objectively. Now we are going to discuss evolutionary species concept. Some authors, particularly paleontologists, are not satisfied with the biological species concept because of its strict applicability only to the non-dimensional situation, and that was time and space. However, paleontologists were working on the animals from different eras and different epochs, so time was a dimension important for them. Similarly, space was also a very important dimension for the people or for the naturalists who were dealing with evolution. So evolutionists prefer a definition which involves an evolutionary criteria defined by Simpson in 1961. An evolutionary species is a lineage, an ancestral descendant sequence of population evolving separately from others with its own unitary roles and tendencies. It was criticized by Meyer in 1982. He said, "This is the definition of a phyletic lineage, not of a species. A lineage is not a population. It is an ancestral descendant phylogenetic relationship. It applies equally to almost any isolate population or incipient species. It does not focuses on the species definition. It basically defines a phyletic lineage. It basically tells about the evolutionary perspective. It also sidesteps the crucial question of what a unitary role is and why phyletic lineage do not interbreed with each other. It fails to delimit species in the time dimension as we consider a sequence of morphotypes in a single phyletic lineage, and we do not know at what point new species with its own evolutionary roles has developed. How are we to know whether these morphotypes have different unitary evolutionary roles and should thus be considered different species, or whether they all have the same unitary evolutionary roles and should thus be treated as chronospecies? Chronospecies are those species which are just identified on the basis of the time scale. For example, if there are different morphotypes and they have been found from different formations which are from different eras, it means that they are different species. Those fossils or those animal species cannot be checked on the basis of the reproductive isolation, on the basis of the ecological perspective, on the basis of the genetic unit. So every species has its own operational role. So these species are may sometimes be called as operational units. So these have their own roles. If we need to understand the evolutionary species concept, we see that these are just on the basis of the morphology, and these are the morphotypes, and they have been taken from different time scale, so they can be called as morphotypes from different chronospecies. Different morphotypes and can be treated as different chronospecies. The principal weakness is that it ignores the core of the species, the problem and maintenance of the discontinuities between contemporary species, and concentrates instead on trying to delimit species taxa in time dimension. Generally, we delimit species on the basis of the reproductive criteria or on the basis of the variation. So previously we have two major species concept, that was typological species concept and biological species concept. Typological species concept was basically focusing on the morphology, morphological markers on the basis of which a species was delimited. However, biological species concept added something new into it, and it added a new criteria, which was reproductive criteria, which was ecological criteria, and there was a genetic criteria. So these three criteria were considered important for the identification or the delimitation of the species. When evolutionary species concept was introduced, it totally ignored the maintenance of discontinuities between the contemporary species. However, it tried to concentrate to delimit species taxa in the time dimension, and the same happened that when the fossils or when the specimens were found from different time dimensions, from different formations, they were identified on the basis of the typological species concept and were considered as separate species, which were basically different chronospecies. Species are developed in two different. Number one, the gradual change of phyletic lineage into different species without changing the number of species, that is called evolution. And number two, the multiplication by a number of the multiplication of by a number of species. For example, that is, you say that a species is diverged into different species. So, evolutionary species concept ignored the fact by which new species is formed. It did not discuss any of the points that how new species could be delimited this way. The species is delimited on the basis of horizontal, space dimension, and vertical, that is time dimension. So, we study species in two dimensions, that is space dimension and time dimension. Mostly the difficulty is faced by the taxonomists during the latter. The biological species addresses specifically with the multiplication of the species, while evolutionary species concept ignores it, dealing only with the phyletic evolution. Apomorphy, a novel evolutionary trait that is unique to a particular species and all its descendants, and which can be used as a defining character for a species or group in phylogenetic terms. According to this concept, a new species originates when a new apomorphy originates in a population. The apomorphy may be as small as a gene, which led to a critic that this way an offspring may be considered as different species from her parent. So, these are the different weaknesses of evolutionary species concept, because if we consider apomorphy which may be as small as a gene, so definitely we can it would lead to a conclusion that an offspring may be considered as different species from her parent. Willey in 1981 attempted to improve the evolutionary species definition by maintenance of identity, which is constructed as reproductive isolation, but his definition is that of a species taxon, not of the species category. Simpson arbitrarily divided the lineage into species by inferring reproductive isolation from the degree of morphological difference without having any strong evidence of the reproductive isolation. It was just inferred from the degree of morphological difference that there might be some kind of reproductive isolation from the samples of different time scale. By contrast, Willey in 1981 believed that no presumed separate single evolutionary lineage may be subdivided into series of ancestral and descendant species, that we cannot divide ancestral descendant lineage into species, which led Simpson to comment that one could start with a man and run back to a protist still in the species Homo sapiens, which was quite right, because if we cannot subdivide the evolutionary lineage into different species on the basis of certain criterion or certain criteria, then starting from the man and going back to the protist will be included in the same species called Homo sapiens. So, that was not true at all. Finally, Hennig in 1966 arbitrarily terminated every evolutionary species when a daughter species branched off the parental lineage, ignoring the fact that a peripatric speciation event usually leaves the parental species unchanged. So, it was arbitrarily decided by Henning that every evolutionary species terminated when a daughter species branched off the parental lineage. However, he ignored the fact that peripatric speciation event usually leaves the parental species unchanged. So, that was the final. Now, this is all about evolutionary species concept and biological species concept, and if you do have any questions, you may ask on the same forum. Thank you so much.